Pollinators, you gotta have them. Welcome back to the Garden Hutch. Today we're going to discuss a few ideas on how to attract pollinators into your garden. Let's get going. Well, pollinators are a must-have for anyone that has a home garden. Also, we need to attract beneficial insects. So in this video, we're going to talk about pollinators. We're also going to talk about beneficial insects. Sometimes like ladybugs, for example, they don't play much of a role in the actual pollination of your vegetables, but they do play a big role in keeping those vegetables safe. So you ladybugs, for example, they eat aphids. Aphids are a pain in the rear end for a lot of different plants. So we'll discuss a lot of that stuff. And a big thing that we like to do is, for a long time, whenever I was younger, before I got into the gardening thing, you know, bugs were bad. When I would look at the garden, I didn't want any bugs in my garden because I associated that with eating my plants, disease, that sort of thing. When in reality, it's quite the opposite. Now, there are some bad bugs. I think about tomato hornworms, that sort of thing. But not all bugs are bad, and not all pollinators are the same, you know, so we do have a lot of different pollinators, but in our mind, the honeybee is the superior, especially whenever we get our honeybees back, because not only do they pollinate your vegetables and your fruit trees and that sort of stuff, they also give you the benefit of having their honey, the propolis, all the wax things that you can make from it. So there's a lot more than just the pollination cycle that we need to think about whenever we look into our attracting the insects to our yard. When we're looking to attract pollinators and beneficial insects, the most important thing is diversity. You want to make sure that you have a wide range of plants available for them. And if you can manage it, it would be preferable to have them bloom in stages throughout the year as well. Just kind of for an example, here at the Garden Hutch, we have the roses of Sharon, and they play a huge part for us in the middle of the summer. A lot of things do not like to bloom whenever it's dry and hot and that sort of thing. And those roses of Sharon, they kick butt. They bring in hummingbirds all year round. They also are a great source of pollen for our honeybees to keep them around. But any of the other bees, whenever things aren't flowering, any of the other pollinators or insects that thrive on, you know, having a source of pollen, they're here. And, you know, in the springtime, we use our, you know, just the natural yard. So, you know, here at the homestead, we don't have the beautiful, what do you want to call it, mat grass, you know, where they come in and sod. We just kind of have weeds, a lot of it. We put out some rudimentary grass seed as well, just something to kind of give it that nice pretty look. But the way that we maintain the diversity and to ensure that we're using local pollinators is when we mow, especially in the springtime, we only mow on a 5. We don't go any lower than that until everything else starts blooming. So, you know, around, I don't know, probably the 1st of June, we'll drop the mower down to a 4. The reason we don't go below a 4, though, it's a little different. It's not necessarily the pollinators, but we like having the lightning bugs in the yard. If you mow it on a 4, it won't pull them out of the ground, and then in the summertime, we can sit back and enjoy watching them light up the yard. But back to the pollinators. If you mow on a 5, all of the things we call weeds, and they are weeds for all intents and purposes, but when you mow on a 5, it gives them a chance in the early springtime to bloom. And when you do that, you start bringing pollinators in and beneficial insects in early. If you can get them in early and often, they're going to be there through the course of the year, especially if they have a consistent food source. So again, that kind of goes back to what we were talking about. You mow on a 5 and you have the weeds that are blooming, that will feed the pollinators and the beneficial insects right up until, you know, that mid-May part where all of the when we're going to get all of the melons blooming, all of the squash will be blooming. Actually, almost everything in the garden will start having blooms at that time of the year. So those weeds will get us, you know, they'll carry us into that middle of the spring, mid to late spring. Just having the weeds available will do that. And cutting it at a 5, it'll give you a certain uniformity to your yard, so it won't look bad. But sometimes, especially here on the homestead, now I can't make that call for you, But here on the homestead, we will sacrifice the aesthetics in order to benefit the garden. But that's our call. That's something everybody kind of has to make on their own. Another great way to ensure that you have the diversity of insect life that you're looking for as far as the pollinator and the beneficial insects is to make sure that each garden that you grow has an area that you specifically plant pollinators. So for example, the garden behind me, the whole bottom row is dedicated to Leslie's wildflowers. So usually, end of March, early April, I'll go through, turn the ground a little bit. She'll put in her pollinator mix. And that'll last, they'll bloom, and it'll have insects, beneficial insects and stuff in it, usually until around the 1st of October. So we believe that if each individual growing space, if you take the time to diversify, first off, diversify the actual garden area itself. So make sure you're not doing the monocropping thing, like all squash or all melons or any of that kind of stuff, or all tomatoes. That's a big mistake a lot of people make. And so a big reason for that, we're going to have the beneficial insects, right? Because we're going to have a whole row that's nothing but wildflowers. But if we take the time, and this whole garden up here is nothing but tomatoes, even if we have the beneficial insects to do things that will, kind of get rid of the hornworms and that sort of thing, if you plant monocrop, you're not going to have enough beneficial insects. So what we try to do is we try to split our tomatoes into 2 separate gardens so that there's not so many of them. And then we interplant them with things like ground cherries. This year we're going to plant our golden wax beans and our green beans in the same area with the tomatoes up here. And what that's going to do is that's going to dilute the garden. And so you're not going to get one area that is specifically for the tomato worm, for example, right? We're not going to have, this is not going to just be covered with tomatoes. So the tomato hornworms, they're not going to be as interested as in if it was just a garden full of them. So that's one way to deter them, is to have a very specific area for each garden that grows the beneficial pollinator plants. And then make sure that you're not doing the monocropping. Make sure that you're interspersing other vegetables and other plants from a different variety, right? So we talked about the squash. Well, squash and melons, the squash bugs, they eat those. They don't care if it's a melon or a squash, they're going to eat it. But the squash bug is not going to affect the golden wax beans. They don't care for your golden wax beans one way or the other. So if you can dilute that population, then those, the bad insects, the aphids, the squash bugs, that sort of stuff, they won't be as attracted to them because there's not as much for them to eat in that specific area. So just to quantify, make sure that whenever you have a growing space that you reserve part of that for specific pollinators. Something that's often overlooked when we're planting our garden are companion plants. So in this video, we're talking about pollinators and how to attract pollinators and beneficial insects. So a lot of that can be, you can plant useful edible plants with other plants to help either A, repel specific insects, or B, attract beneficial insects. And so, for example, what we like to do is we like to plant basil and marigolds with our tomatoes. Basil and marigolds, both, they attract very good insects, and there's a lot of things that dislike the smell or the oils that are put off by basil and marigolds. And they do different things, right? So these are just examples, but the basil plants, for example, hornworms, they don't like the smell of basil plants, so it'll reject them, and it'll reject things like, or in your marigolds, aphids and nematodes don't care for the smell of marigolds. Now there's a bunch of these, and we can go through. I'll probably make a companion planting video at some point. There's a lot that goes into it, and the best way to do it is to kind of start with what you want to plant. That's how we got into it. Anybody who watches this channel knows I love tomatoes. A big part of growing tomatoes are keeping insects and things away from them, or the bad insects. And then if you can bring in the good insects, that will really help you out a lot when it comes to that. So again, using the tomatoes as an example, plant your basil plants. That will repel whiteflies. That'll repel things like your horned worms. Plant marigolds. That'll get rid of your aphids and your nematodes. There are also several other, like I said, the list is too long to mention. Those are the examples that I use, but if you're having an issue in your area with a specific plant, so let's say it's squash or whatever, just do a little research and find out what the companion planting for those are. Or if you'd like, leave a comment below and let us know what you're having a problem with, and I'll be happy to do the research for you. The final tip for pollinators that we'll go over in today's video is leave your plants in the ground until the next spring. Here at the Garden Hutch, my reflex is as soon as things start dying off, I like to go through, clean up my garden areas and start prepping for the following year. And that is okay to do for things like tomatoes and peppers, eggplant, that sort of stuff. When it comes to our pollinator plants, however, we want to leave them in there. The reason for that is we plant these specifically to attract beneficial insects and pollinators. So what you do is those insects will lay a lot of times their eggs on those plants, on the bottom of the leaves or in the little crotch of the stems. And what happens is if you leave them there, whenever the spring comes, things start warming up the following year, those beneficial plants will hatch, or those beneficial insects, I'm sorry, will hatch off of those plants in the early spring. And what that means is you don't have to take the time going forward to, or as much time, I'm sorry, and effort to attract the pollinators, right? So what's going to happen is if you take this approach to it, every year you're going to start with more than you did the year before. You're also going to attract more in, and they're already going to be there when those pesky insects start coming in. Your beneficial insects will already be there. They'll already be established, and they'll have a leg up of anything coming in and I guess trying to invade, maybe being, for lack of a better word, your garden space. It makes a lot of sense if you think about it, right? If you start off with, with more of the beneficial insects and less of the pain insects, you're going to have a more successful gardening year. So do yourself a favor, and I know we all want to clean it up as soon as we can in the fall, but just the pollinators, right? Just leave those there until the next spring. Once it starts getting warming up and you see kind of, you see the weeds popping up and start to bloom, more than likely at that point, those eggs have already hatched. So you can go ahead and take that stuff out, throw it in the compost pile and move on. But it gives you a huge leg up in your battle against the bad insects. Well, as always, I would like to say thank you to all you folks that have made it this far. If you have not, please consider subscribing to the channel. You can hit the little bell icon and YouTube will let you know when we upload new content. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like. Until next time, I hope you folks take care of yourselves. Peace.